Ladies and gentlemen, the Wild West. Those two words conjure up vivid images of dusty plains, vast open landscapes, and the untamed frontier where law and lawlessness coexisted in a delicate balance. It was a time of great adventure, brutal hardships, and the relentless pursuit of opportunity. Between the mid-1800s and early 1900s, the American West was a land unlike any other, filled with people seeking fortune, freedom, and a fresh start. But behind the romanticized tales of cowboy duels and saloon shootouts lies the true essence of the Wild West, an era shaped by resilience, diversity, and rapid change. The West was more than just a backdrop for legendary gunfighters and outlaws. It was an expansive, rugged terrain stretching from the Mississippi River to the Pacific Ocean, encompassing deserts, mountains, prairies, and forests. This vast landscape was both a promise and a challenge, offering land and resources to those willing to fight for them, yet demanding strength and endurance for survival. Settlers moving westward faced blistering summers, harsh winters, and the constant threat of attacks from bandits, rival settlers, or even the elements themselves. The idea of the American frontier had existed for centuries, but it was during the 19th century that it became the focal point of the nation's growth. The California Gold Rush of 1849, the Homestead Act of 1862, and the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad in 1869 all contributed to the rapid expansion of settlers, towns, and industries into the Western territories. However, this expansion was not without consequences. Native American tribes who had lived on these lands for generations found themselves increasingly pushed aside, forced onto reservations, or driven into conflicts with settlers and soldiers. Unlike the orderly growth of cities in the East, the towns of the Wild West often sprang up overnight. A single gold strike could transform a barren valley into a bustling boom town, drawing miners, merchants, and fortune seekers from all over the world. But just as quickly as these towns rose, they could fall, leaving behind little more than abandoned buildings and empty saloons. Law and order were often an afterthought in these frontier settlements, where disputes were sometimes settled with a gun rather than a judge. Yet, for all its dangers and lawlessness, the Wild West represented something deeply ingrained in the American spirit: the belief in self-reliance, hard work, and the idea that anyone, regardless of their background, could carve out a place for themselves. It was a land of contradictions, where legendary lawmen walked the same streets as notorious criminals, where railroad tycoons built vast empires while cowboys herded cattle across open plains, and where freedom and violence coexisted in an uneasy but undeniable dance. As we explore the real Wild West, we must set aside the myths and look at the stories of those who lived through it. It was a time of pioneers, warriors, dreamers, and opportunists, each playing a role in shaping the frontier into what it became. The Wild West may have faded into history, but its legacy remains woven into the fabric of American culture, a testament to the strength, determination, and sometimes reckless ambition of those who dared to venture into the unknown. When we think of the Wild West, the first image that often comes to mind is that of a lone cowboy riding across the open plains, his hat pulled low over his eyes, a six-shooter at his side. But the real Wild West was far more diverse than popular culture suggests. It was not just a land of cowboys and outlaws. It was a melting pot of people from different backgrounds, races, and walks of life, all trying to carve out an existence in an unpredictable and often unforgiving land. At the heart of the West were the Native American tribes, who had lived on these lands for centuries before settlers arrived. From the Apache in the deserts of the Southwest to the Sioux of the Great Plains, these tribes had their own ways of life, traditions, and deep spiritual connections to the land. But with the arrival of European settlers and the relentless push of westward expansion, many of these tribes found themselves in conflict with the newcomers. Some resisted through warfare, while others attempted to adapt and coexist. But ultimately, many were forced from their ancestral lands and relocated to reservations, forever changing their way of life. Alongside the Native Americans were the Cowboys, a group that has been mythologized more than almost any other. Contrary to the image portrayed in movies, cowboys were not just white Americans. In fact, a significant percentage of them were Black, Hispanic, or even Native American. Many formerly enslaved African Americans, seeking freedom and opportunity after the Civil War, found work as cattle herders, trail riders, and ranch hands. Mexican vaqueros, the original cowboys, brought their expertise in cattle ranching to the American frontier, influencing the techniques and traditions that would define cowboy culture. The Wild West was also home to a wide array of immigrants who came seeking fortune and a fresh start. Chinese laborers played a crucial role in building the Transcontinental Railroad, enduring backbreaking labor, discrimination, and harsh conditions to help connect the East and West coasts. Irish, German, and Italian immigrants arrived in droves, finding work as miners, railroad workers, and farmers, each bringing their own customs and cultures to the growing towns of the frontier. Beyond cowboys and immigrants, there were also the lawmen and outlaws, two sides of the same coin in the untamed West. Sheriffs, marshals, and bounty hunters worked to establish some semblance of law and order in the often chaotic towns, but their success varied widely. Some became legends, known for their quick draw and fearless pursuit of justice, while others walked a fine line between enforcing the law and bending it for their own gain. On the other hand, outlaws and bandits roamed the countryside, robbing banks, trains, and stagecoaches, leaving behind tales of daring heists and infamous gunfights that would later be immortalized in folklore. Women, often overlooked in stories of the Wild West, played an essential role in shaping frontier life. They were not just school teachers and homemakers. Many were ranchers, business owners, and even gunslingers. Some disguised themselves as men to work as cowboys, while others made their mark as notorious outlaws or fearless sharpshooters. Women ran saloons, owned land, and even worked as doctors and lawyers in towns that were just beginning to establish themselves. The West may have been a rugged and lawless place, but women played just as significant a role in its development as men. The real Wild West was not a simple world of good versus evil, nor was it dominated by a single type of person. It was a land shaped by a complex mix of cultures, races, and ambitions. The people who inhabited it, Native Americans, cowboys, settlers, immigrants, outlaws, and lawmen, each left their mark, contributing to the tapestry of history that defines the American frontier. For many, the Wild West exists as a world of high-noon duels, fearless cowboys, and legendary outlaws, thanks to the way Hollywood has romanticized it. Classic Western films depict a land where justice is delivered at the barrel of a gun, where heroes wear white hats and villains wear black, and where life, despite its dangers, seems to follow an exciting and adventurous script. But the real Wild West was far less glamorous and far more brutal than what we see on the silver screen. Life on the frontier was not about thrilling gunfights and daring rescues. It was about survival. One of the biggest myths is that the Wild West was a place of constant gunfights, where outlaws and lawmen squared off in deadly duels in the middle of dusty streets. In reality, shootouts were far less common than movies suggest. While there were certainly violent conflicts, most disputes were settled through intimidation, negotiation, or outright ambush rather than dramatic, drawn-out gunfights. The infamous quick-draw duel, where two opponents faced each other in the middle of town and drew their pistols at the same time, was more of a Hollywood invention than a historical reality. Another misconception is that the West was entirely lawless. While it is true that law enforcement in many frontier towns was weak or corrupt, it wasn't completely absent. Many towns had sheriffs, marshals, and judges who did their best to maintain order. The problem was that laws were difficult to enforce across such a vast and sparsely populated territory. Vigilante justice was common, with citizens taking the law into their own hands through public hangings or forming posses to track down criminals. This rough form of justice contributed to the idea of the West as a violent, untamed land, but in reality, most frontier towns worked hard to establish rules and stability. Hollywood also portrays cowboys as lone drifters, wandering from town to town in search of adventure. In truth, being a cowboy was less about freedom and gunfights and more about hard labor. Cowboys spent long days herding cattle, dealing with harsh weather, and sleeping under the open sky. Their job was exhausting, dirty, and often dangerous, not because of bandits or duels, but because of the physical demands of the work itself. Many cowboys were young men, some as young as 15, who worked for low wages and had little hope of ever owning their own land. They were more likely to die from a fall off a horse or a stampede than from a gunfight. The myth of the noble, fearless sheriff who single-handedly kept the peace is also exaggerated. While some lawmen became famous for their roles in history, most were ordinary men trying to do a difficult job. Many lawmen had questionable pasts themselves, with some having been outlaws before taking on the badge. Corruption was common, and in many cases, sheriffs and marshals were either too afraid to stand up to powerful criminals or were on the payroll of the very gangs they were supposed to be fighting. Another falsehood is the idea that the Wild West was a place of endless freedom and opportunity for all. While many people did travel west in search of a better life, not everyone found prosperity. Many settlers arrived only to struggle with poor soil, harsh weather, and isolation. Farming was backbreaking work, and the land often did not yield the riches people had hoped for. Those who failed were forced to move on, leaving behind ghost towns that still dot the landscape today. Finally, Hollywood tends to erase the diversity of the West. Western films often depict a world dominated by white cowboys. Yet in reality, a significant portion of the population was made up of black cowboys, Mexican vaqueros, Chinese railroad workers, Native Americans, and immigrants from all over the world. The Wild West was one of the most diverse periods in American history, but its true story is often overshadowed by the myths that movies and books have created. The real Wild West was not a land of heroic gunslingers and clear-cut battles between good and evil. It was a place of hardship, struggle, and survival. While the myths of the West may make for exciting stories, the truth is far more complex and far more fascinating. When people think of the Wild West, they often picture rugged cowboys, notorious outlaws, and fearless lawmen. However, one of the most overlooked but essential groups in shaping the American frontier was the women of the West. While Hollywood often portrays them as saloon girls, damsels in distress, or supporting characters to the men, the reality was far different. Women were pioneers, ranchers, entrepreneurs, doctors, teachers, sharpshooters, and even outlaws. They played a crucial role in taming the West and building the foundations of many communities that still exist today. For many women, moving west was not a choice, but a necessity. Families seeking a better life or new opportunities often traveled thousands of miles across treacherous landscapes, and women were expected to endure the same hardships as men. The journey was brutal, filled with threats from disease, starvation, extreme weather, and attacks from bandits or hostile groups. Once they arrived, life was not much easier. Women had to help build homes, cook, sew, and care for children while also working alongside men in the fields, tending to livestock, and defending their property when necessary. The idea that women were simply homemakers in the West is a myth. Many were just as involved in survival and economic success as their male counterparts. One of the most significant roles women played was in homesteading. The Homestead Act of 1862 offered free land to those willing to cultivate it, and thousands of women took advantage of this opportunity. Unlike in the East, where women were often dependent on their husbands or fathers for land ownership, the West allowed many women to become landowners in their own right. Single women, widows, and even divorced women could claim land, proving that the frontier was not just a man's world. These women worked tirelessly, plowing fields, raising crops, and enduring harsh weather conditions to build a life for themselves and their families. Women also made their mark in business and entrepreneurship. With many towns lacking established services, women stepped in to fill the gaps. Some ran general stores, while others opened boarding houses, laundries, and restaurants. A few even became wealthy as madams running brothels, which, despite their controversial nature, were often some of the most profitable businesses in frontier towns. These women were not just passive figures. They made economic decisions, controlled large sums of money, and wielded influence in their communities. Education and medicine were also areas where women played an essential role. Many towns lacked doctors and teachers, so women stepped up to provide these critical services. Female doctors and midwives were vital in treating injuries, delivering babies, and caring for the sick, often with little formal medical training, but with an incredible amount of knowledge passed down through generations. School teachers, many of whom were young women from the East, traveled west to educate children in one-room schoolhouses, helping to bring literacy and learning to the frontier. Without these women, many Western settlements would have struggled to grow into stable communities. But not all women in the West followed traditional paths. Some took up arms and became notorious figures in their own right. Female outlaws, gamblers, and sharpshooters gained fame, defying societal expectations. Some disguised themselves as men to join gangs or the military, while others openly lived as gunfighters or bounty hunters. These women proved that toughness and survival were not qualities reserved for men. Women also played a critical role in social activism. Many were involved in the temperance movement, fighting against the widespread alcoholism that plagued many frontier towns. Others fought for women's suffrage, arguing that the hard work they did alongside men entitled them to the right to vote. In fact, it was in the Western territories that women first gained voting rights. Wyoming granted women the right to vote in 1869, long before the rest of the country followed suit. The women of the Wild West were more than just supporting characters in the story of America's expansion. They were leaders, fighters, builders, and pioneers. They endured hardships, broke barriers, and shaped the frontier in ways that are often forgotten. Their contributions were just as vital as those of the cowboys and outlaws who have dominated the legends of the West. When people think of the Wild West, they often picture rugged cowboys, notorious outlaws, and fearless lawmen. However, one of the most overlooked but essential groups in shaping the American frontier was the women of the West. While Hollywood often portrays them as saloon girls, damsels in distress, or supporting characters to men, the reality was far different. Women were pioneers, ranchers, entrepreneurs, doctors, teachers, sharpshooters, and even outlaws. They played a crucial role in taming the West and building the foundations of many communities that still exist today. For many women, moving west was not a choice but a necessity. Families seeking a better life or new opportunities often traveled thousands of miles across treacherous landscapes, and women were expected to endure the same hardships as men. The journey was brutal, filled with threats from disease, starvation, extreme weather, and attacks from bandits or hostile groups. Once they arrived, life was not much easier. Women had to help build homes, cook, sew, and care for children, while also working alongside men in the fields, tending to livestock and defending their property when necessary. The idea that women were simply homemakers in the West is a myth. Many were just as involved in survival and economic success as their male counterparts. Women as homesteaders and landowners. One of the most significant roles women played was in homesteading. The Homestead Act of 1862 offered free land to those willing to cultivate it, and thousands of women took advantage of this opportunity. Unlike in the East, where women were often dependent on their husbands or fathers for land ownership, the West allowed many women to become landowners in their own right. Single women, widows, and even divorced women could claim land, proving that the frontier was not just a man's world. These women worked tirelessly, plowing fields, raising crops, and enduring harsh weather conditions to build a life for themselves and their families. Farming was not easy. Women had to learn how to plant and harvest crops, care for livestock, and make their own tools and clothing. In times of drought, they had to find ways to keep their crops alive with limited water. In winter, they faced freezing temperatures and heavy snowstorms that could isolate them for months. Many women built their own homes from sod or logs, using whatever materials they could find. They learned how to hunt for food, make their own medicines, and defend themselves from wild animals and thieves. These women were not fragile. They were strong, resourceful, and determined. Women in business and entrepreneurship. Women also made their mark in business and entrepreneurship. With many towns lacking established services, women stepped in to fill the gaps. Some ran general stores, while others opened boarding houses, laundries, and restaurants. A few even became wealthy as madams running brothels, which, despite their controversial nature, were often some of the most profitable businesses in frontier towns. These women were not just passive figures. They made economic decisions, controlled large sums of money, and wielded influence in their communities. One of the most famous female entrepreneurs was Mary Ellen Pleasant, an African-American woman who moved west and became a successful businesswoman and activist. She used her wealth to support abolitionist causes and even helped finance John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry. Other women built successful hotels and trading posts, providing essential services to travelers and settlers. Some invested in mining operations or bought and sold land, proving that women could be just as ambitious and financially savvy as men. Women as educators and healers. Education and medicine were also areas where women played an essential role. Many towns lacked doctors and teachers, so women stepped up to provide these critical services. Female doctors and midwives were vital in treating injuries, delivering babies, and caring for the sick, often with little formal medical training, but with an incredible amount of knowledge passed down through generations. School teachers, many of whom were young women from the East, traveled west to educate children in one-room schoolhouses, helping to bring literacy and learning to the frontier. Without these women, many Western settlements would have struggled to grow into stable communities. Women also acted as herbalists and healers, using natural remedies to treat illnesses and injuries. In a time when professional medical care was rare, these women saved countless lives through their knowledge of plants and traditional medicine. Some even traveled long distances to provide care to isolated families, becoming essential figures in their communities. Women in law, politics, and activism. Though the West was often seen as a rugged, lawless place, it also became a testing ground for women's rights. Many women in the West fought for legal and social equality. They argued that if they could work alongside men in building communities, farming land, and raising livestock, then they deserved the same rights and opportunities. One of the most notable advancements for women in the West was the right to vote. While women in the eastern United States were still fighting for suffrage, women in Wyoming were granted the right to vote in 1869, followed by other Western territories like Utah and Colorado. The West became a leader in the movement for women's rights, recognizing the essential role women played in society. Women also participated in law enforcement and politics. Some became sheriff's deputies or town officials. Others worked as journalists, writing about issues that affected frontier life. The West provided opportunities for women to break free from traditional roles and shape the future of their communities in ways that were unheard of in other parts of the country. Women as sharpshooters and outlaws. Not all women in the Wild West followed traditional paths. Some took up arms and became notorious figures in their own right. Female outlaws, gamblers, and sharpshooters gained fame, defying societal expectations. Some disguised themselves as men to join gangs or the military, while others openly lived as gunfighters or bounty hunters. These women proved that toughness and survival were not qualities reserved for men. One of the most famous sharpshooters was Annie Oakley, who became a legend for her incredible marksmanship skills. She traveled with Buffalo Bill's Wild West show, amazing audiences with her ability to shoot targets while riding horseback or even while looking in a mirror. There were also female outlaws like Belle Starr, who became known as the Bandit Queen. She was involved in horse theft and armed robbery, and built a reputation as one of the most feared women in the West. Another infamous woman was Pearl Hart, who was one of the few female stagecoach robbers in history. She disguised herself as a man and led daring heists, proving that women could be just as dangerous as their male counterparts. The true legacy of women in the Wild West. The women of the Wild West were more than just supporting characters in the story of America's expansion. They were leaders, fighters, builders, and pioneers. They endured hardships, broke barriers, and shaped the frontier in ways that are often forgotten. Their contributions were just as vital as those of the cowboys and outlaws who have dominated the legends of the West. The story of the Wild West is often told through the lens of cowboys, lawmen, and settlers, but at its heart, it is also a story of loss, resilience, and survival, particularly for the Native American tribes who had called the land home for centuries. Before European settlers ever set foot on the Great Plains, the deserts of the Southwest, or the forests of the Pacific Northwest, these lands were inhabited by thriving indigenous nations, each with their own cultures, languages, and ways of life. However, the westward expansion of the United States brought devastation to Native American communities, leading to a tragic chapter of displacement, conflict, and forced assimilation. For centuries, Native American tribes lived off the land, adapting to the unique challenges of the environment. The Lakota Sioux and Cheyenne followed massive herds of buffalo across the plains, using every part of the animal for food, clothing, and shelter. The Apache and Comanche, fierce warriors and expert horse riders, controlled vast territories in the Southwest. The Nez Perce, known for their deep respect for nature, lived in the forests of the Northwest. Each tribe had its own way of life, but all shared a common connection to the land. A connection that was soon threatened by the arrival of settlers, railroads, and military forces. The expansion that brought conflict. The westward expansion of settlers in the 19th century, fueled by policies like the Homestead Act of 1862 and the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad in 1869, put immense pressure on Native American lands. Gold rushes in California, the Black Hills, and other regions drew thousands of people westward, pushing native tribes off their ancestral lands. What was once a vast and open landscape quickly became divided by railroad tracks, fenced-off homesteads, and booming frontier towns. As settlers moved in, treaties were signed, often under false pretenses or through coercion, forcing Native American tribes onto reservations. The U.S. government frequently broke these treaties when settlers demanded more land. Tribes that resisted were met with military force, leading to a series of brutal conflicts that would define the late 19th century. One of the most infamous of these conflicts was the Sand Creek Massacre of 1864, where U.S. soldiers attacked a peaceful Cheyenne and Arapaho village in Colorado, killing more than 150 men, women, and children. The violence only escalated from there, leading to decades of war between native tribes and the U.S. government. The Indian Wars and Acts of Resistance. Native American resistance took many forms. Some fought to defend their land through open warfare, while others sought diplomatic solutions. Leaders like Sitting Bull of the Lakota Sioux, Crazy Horse, and Geronimo of the Apache became symbols of defiance against U.S. expansion. One of the most significant Native American victories came at the Battle of Little Bighorn in 1876, also known as Custer's Last Stand. This battle saw the combined forces of the Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors defeat General George Custer and his troops. It was a moment of triumph, proving that Native resistance was far from over. However, this victory was short-lived, as the U.S. government responded with even greater military force, hunting down and subduing Native resistance across the West. Geronimo, the Apache leader, led a prolonged guerrilla war against U.S. and Mexican forces, refusing to surrender until 1886. He and his followers endured relentless pursuit, navigating the deserts and mountains of the Southwest with remarkable skill. However, the overwhelming power of the U.S. military eventually forced even the fiercest warriors into submission. Forced removal and the trail of broken promises. Even when Native American tribes agreed to move onto reservations, they were often given land that was barren and unsuitable for farming. Food rations from the U.S. government were often spoiled or inadequate, leading to widespread hunger and suffering. Many tribes, who had once been self-sufficient hunters and farmers, were forced into dependence on government aid. One of the most tragic policies of this era was the Indian Removal Act and the subsequent forced relocations that became known as the Trail of Tears. While this act originally targeted eastern tribes like the Cherokee, the practice of forced relocation continued in the West, with many tribes being uprooted from their homelands and sent to distant, unfamiliar territories. The Dawes Act of 1887 further aimed to dismantle Native American cultures by dividing tribal land into individual plots and encouraging Native people to adopt European-style farming. This act not only stripped tribes of their communal land ownership traditions, but also resulted in the loss of millions of acres of native land, as much of it was eventually sold to white settlers. The tragedy of Wounded Knee. By the late 19th century, Native American resistance was fading, but the injustices against them were far from over. In 1890, one of the most tragic events in Native American history occurred at Wounded Knee, South Dakota. The U.S. Army surrounded a Lakota camp and, after a misunderstanding during a weapon confiscation, opened fire, killing over 250 men, women, and children. This massacre marked the end of armed Native resistance in the United States and symbolized the brutal suppression of indigenous cultures. Cultural suppression and survival. Beyond physical battles, Native Americans also faced an attack on their identity. The U.S. government and Christian missionaries established boarding schools designed to civilize Native children by forcing them to abandon their languages, traditions, and beliefs. These children were often taken from their families and placed in institutions where they were forbidden to speak their native languages and were punished for practicing their customs. Despite these hardships, Native American cultures persisted. Many tribes kept their languages alive in secret, passed down their traditions through storytelling, and held on to their spiritual practices despite government bans. Over time, Native activism grew, leading to movements that fought for sovereignty, cultural preservation, and recognition of past injustices. The legacy of Native American resistance. The struggles of Native American tribes in the Wild West were not just battles over land. They were battles for identity, survival, and dignity. Despite centuries of oppression, forced relocation, and broken promises, Native American communities endured. Today, their contributions to American history are increasingly recognized, and efforts to reclaim their languages, traditions, and rights continue. The true story of the Wild West is not just one of cowboys and outlaws. It is also a story of Native resilience. It is a history filled with sorrow and injustice, but also with remarkable strength and resistance. The Native American people fought not just against the loss of their land, but against the erasure of their culture, and their legacy remains a vital part of the history of the American frontier. The Wild West is often remembered as a lawless land where outlaws roamed freely, robbing banks, holding up stagecoaches, and engaging in dramatic gunfights. While crime and violence were indeed part of life on the frontier, the idea that the West was completely without law and order is a myth. Lawmen played a crucial role in bringing justice to the region, often facing extreme challenges in their fight against crime. From sheriffs and U.S. Marshals to bounty hunters and judges, these men, sometimes flawed, sometimes heroic, worked to establish law and order in a land that was constantly changing. The challenges of frontier justice. Unlike the well-established legal systems in the eastern United States, the Wild West was still developing its institutions of justice. In many cases, towns grew so quickly that they lacked formal law enforcement, leaving justice in the hands of the people. Vigilante groups often formed to deal with criminals, sometimes acting as judge, jury, and executioner in the absence of an official court system. While this rough form of justice helped keep order in some places, it also led to abuses, with innocent people sometimes being hanged based on rumor and suspicion alone. As towns became more settled, local governments appointed sheriffs and marshals to maintain order. These lawmen were responsible for arresting criminals, breaking up fights, and enforcing local laws. However, their jobs were anything but easy. Many sheriffs operated with little backup, often facing entire gangs of outlaws on their own. Their pay was low, their resources were limited, and their lives were constantly at risk. Some were honest and hardworking, dedicated to protecting the townspeople, while others were corrupt, using their badges to control gambling, alcohol sales, or even criminal enterprises. Famous lawmen of the Wild West. While many lawmen toiled in obscurity, some became legends. Perhaps the most famous was Wyatt Earp, who served as a lawman in several frontier towns and became famous for his role in the legendary gunfight at the OK Corral in 1881. Alongside his brothers and Doc Holliday, Earp confronted a group of outlaws known as the Cowboys in Tombstone, Arizona, in a deadly shootout that cemented his place in Wild West history. Another well-known lawman was Wild Bill Hickok, a former soldier, gambler, and gunfighter who became a U.S. Marshal. Hickok was known for his quick draw and deadly accuracy with a revolver, and he made a name for himself enforcing the law in places like Abilene, Kansas. However, his life was cut short when he was shot in the back while playing poker in Deadwood, South Dakota, a grim reminder that even the most feared gunmen were never truly safe. Bass Reeves, one of the first black U.S. Marshals west of the Mississippi, is another figure whose story deserves recognition. Born into slavery, Reeves escaped to Indian Territory, modern-day Oklahoma, and later became a highly respected lawman. He is credited with arresting over 3,000 criminals during his career, earning a reputation as one of the toughest marshals in the West. Some historians even believe that Reeves may have been the real-life inspiration for the Lone Ranger. Pat Garrett is best known for tracking down and killing the infamous outlaw Billy the Kid in 1881. A former buffalo hunter and rancher, Garrett was elected sheriff of Lincoln County, New Mexico, and quickly became involved in one of the most famous manhunts in Western history. His pursuit of Billy the Kid turned him into a legendary figure, though his later years were filled with hardship, and he was ultimately killed under mysterious circumstances. The fight against outlaws and criminal gangs. Lawmen in the Wild West had no shortage of criminals to deal with. Notorious gangs like the James Younger Gang, the Dalton Gang, and Butch Cassidy's Wild Bunch terrorized towns, robbing banks, trains, and stagecoaches. These outlaws were often well-armed, highly skilled horsemen, and deeply familiar with the terrain, making them difficult to capture. Train and stagecoach robberies were particularly challenging for law enforcement. Criminals would often strike in remote locations where they could quickly escape into the wilderness. Posses, groups of deputized citizens, were sometimes formed to chase down bandits, but success was never guaranteed. In many cases, outlaws managed to evade capture for years, living under assumed names or disappearing into lawless territories where they could operate freely. One of the most famous outlaws of the West was Jesse James, who, along with his brother Frank, led a gang of criminals that robbed banks and trains across multiple states. Despite being hunted by law enforcement for years, Jesse was able to elude capture until he was betrayed and shot by one of his own gang members in 1882. Billy the Kid, another legendary outlaw, became famous for his daring escapes and deadly encounters with the law. According to legend, he killed 21 men before being gunned down by Sheriff Pat Garrett. However, some historians believe the real number of his victims was much lower. Bounty hunters and vigilante justice. Because law enforcement was stretched thin across the vast Western territories, bounty hunters played an important role in tracking down fugitives. These men were often former soldiers, cowboys, or even outlaws themselves, willing to hunt dangerous criminals in exchange for reward money. Some bounty hunters became famous for their skills, while others were little more than hired guns willing to take justice into their own hands. One of the biggest challenges for lawmen and bounty hunters alike was bringing criminals to justice in a fair and legal manner. Many frontier towns lacked proper court systems, meaning that justice was often delivered on the spot. In some cases, criminals were given a quick trial before being hanged from the nearest tree or gallows. In others, they were simply shot down without any legal process. Vigilante justice was common in the West, especially in places where law enforcement was weak or corrupt. Groups of citizens would sometimes take matters into their own hands, hunting down suspected criminals and executing them without a trial. While this helped deter crime in some areas, it also led to tragic cases of mistaken identity, where innocent people were punished based on false accusations. The evolution of law and order. As the West became more settled, the rule of law gradually became stronger. Federal marshals, state police forces, and better organized local governments helped bring stability to formerly lawless regions. Railroads and telegraphs improved communication, allowing lawmen to track criminals more effectively. Courts and prisons were established, offering a more structured legal system. Despite these improvements, the legacy of the Wild West lawmen remains complicated. Some were heroes who risked their lives to protect their towns, while others were little better than the outlaws they pursued. Many lawmen walked a fine line between justice and brutality, enforcing the law in a time when survival often depended on who could draw their gun the fastest. The struggle for law and order in the Wild West is one of the most defining aspects of its history. It was a time when justice was often delivered at the end of a gun barrel, when sheriffs and marshals stood alone against overwhelming odds, and when the fight between good and evil was never as simple as it seemed. The construction of the railroad was one of the most revolutionary developments in the history of the American West. Before the arrival of the iron rails, travel across the vast frontier was slow, dangerous, and grueling. Wagon trains took months to make the journey westward, with settlers facing extreme weather, disease, and attacks from outlaws or hostile groups. The completion of the Transcontinental Railroad in 1869 changed everything, turning what was once a perilous expedition into a matter of days. It connected the East with the West, fueled economic growth, encouraged migration, and reshaped the landscape in ways that would leave a lasting impact on the region. The race to build the Transcontinental Railroad. The idea of a railroad stretching from coast to coast had been discussed for decades, but the Civil War delayed its construction. After the war, the U.S. government passed the Pacific Railway Act of 1862, authorizing two railroad companies, the Union Pacific and the Central Pacific, to begin construction from opposite sides of the country. The Union Pacific started in Omaha, Nebraska, while the Central Pacific began in Sacramento, California. The two lines would eventually meet in Promontory, Utah, in 1869, where a golden spike was driven into the final track, symbolizing the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad. The construction process was anything but easy. Workers had to carve tunnels through mountains, build bridges over rivers, and lay tracks across vast, empty plains. The labor force was made up of a diverse group of people, including thousands of Irish immigrants, former Civil War soldiers, and freed slaves working for the Union Pacific. Meanwhile, on the Central Pacific side, Chinese laborers played a crucial role, enduring harsh conditions as they blasted through the treacherous Sierra Nevada mountains. These workers were often underpaid, overworked, and subjected to dangerous conditions. Yet their efforts helped shape the future of the West. The economic boom and the rise of boomtowns. The completion of the railroad unleashed an economic explosion. Goods that once took months to transport by wagon could now be shipped in days, allowing businesses to expand and new industries to flourish. Cattle ranchers could send their livestock to markets in the East, farmers could sell their crops to distant cities, and miners could quickly transport gold, silver, and other valuable minerals. Along the railroad's route, new towns sprang up almost overnight. These boom towns, built to serve railroad workers and travelers, quickly became hubs of activity. Some of these settlements, like Cheyenne, Wyoming, and Denver, Colorado, grew into major cities that still exist today. Others, however, faded into ghost towns once the railroad moved on, leaving behind abandoned buildings and a lingering sense of lost opportunity. The railroad also fueled a land rush. The U.S. government offered land grants to settlers willing to establish farms along the rail lines, leading to a massive migration of people looking for new opportunities. The once sparsely populated Great Plains became home to thousands of new settlers, transforming the landscape from open prairie to farmland almost overnight. The end of the open range and the cowboy era. The arrival of the railroad also played a major role in ending the era of the open range and the cowboy lifestyle. Before the railroad, cattle drives were essential for getting livestock to market. Cowboys herded thousands of cattle from Texas to railheads in Kansas, where the animals were then shipped east. This was the golden age of the cowboy, filled with long journeys, harsh conditions, and dangerous encounters with rustlers and outlaws. However, as the railroad expanded, the need for cattle drives diminished. Ranchers could now load their cattle directly onto train cars, eliminating the need for long and treacherous drives across the plains. Barbed wire, another invention of the late 19th century, further changed the landscape, as large open grazing lands were fenced off, ending the free-roaming lifestyle of the cowboy. The railroad and the displacement of Native Americans. While the railroad brought prosperity to many, it also had devastating consequences for Native American tribes. The tracks cut through lands that had been home to indigenous peoples for centuries, disrupting their way of life and pushing them further onto reservations. Buffalo, a vital resource for many Plains tribes, were slaughtered in massive numbers, both to feed railroad workers and to clear the way for trains. Some railroad companies even organized hunting excursions where passengers could shoot buffalo from moving trains, further devastating the herds. Without the buffalo, many Native American tribes struggled to survive. Their resistance against westward expansion grew stronger, leading to intensified conflicts with the U.S. government. Tribes like the Sioux, Cheyenne, and Comanche fought fiercely to defend their land, but the railroad allowed the U.S. military to move troops and supplies quickly, making it easier to suppress Native resistance. The construction of railroads played a direct role in the forced removal of tribes from their homelands and the ultimate destruction of their traditional way of life. The railroad and the rise of outlaws. With the expansion of rail lines came a new opportunity for outlaws looking to make a fortune. Train robberies became a major problem, as criminals targeted locomotives carrying money, gold, and other valuables. Some of the most notorious outlaws of the Wild West, including Jesse James, Butch Cassidy, and the Sundance Kid, made their names robbing trains. These robberies often became legendary, capturing the imagination of the public. In some cases, outlaws would even take hostages or blow up train cars to access safe boxes. Railroad companies responded by hiring armed guards, marshals, and even the Pinkerton National Detective Agency to track down and capture these criminals. The battle between train robbers and lawmen became one of the defining conflicts of the Wild West, adding to its reputation as a land of danger and adventure. The railroad and immigration. The railroad also played a major role in shaping the demographic landscape of the West. Chinese immigrants, who had worked tirelessly on the Central Pacific Railroad, faced extreme discrimination once the tracks were completed. Many were forced out of railroad jobs and settled in isolated communities, often taking on low-paying work in laundries, restaurants, and small businesses. These Chinatowns became vibrant cultural centers but also targets for racist violence and restrictive laws, such as the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. Meanwhile, European immigrants, particularly Germans, Scandinavians, and Irish, were drawn to the opportunities created by the railroad. Many settled in the Midwest and Great Plains, starting farms and helping to build new towns. Their influence is still seen today in the architecture, traditions, and food of many Western states. The railroad's lasting legacy. The railroad transformed the Wild West in every way imaginable. It turned vast, untamed frontiers into bustling towns and cities. It brought industry, commerce, and new settlers, fueling America's expansion across the continent. At the same time, it brought conflict, displacement, and destruction to Native American cultures and traditional ways of life. Even today, the legacy of the railroad can still be seen in the towns, trade routes, and industries that define the American West. The iron rails not only reshaped the land, but also the people who lived there, marking the end of one era and the beginning of another. You said, expand the 8 key, make it lengthy, don't add ending. ChatGPT said, ChatGPT, women in the Wild West, pioneers, entrepreneurs, and trailblazers. The story of the Wild West has often been told through the lens of cowboys, lawmen, and outlaws, but behind the scenes, women played an equally vital role in shaping the frontier. Whether as homesteaders, entrepreneurs, teachers, nurses, or even outlaws and sharpshooters, women were an essential part of the development of the West. They faced immense hardships, from harsh living conditions and lawlessness to the challenges of surviving in a male-dominated society. Yet, despite these obstacles, many women thrived, carving out independent lives and leaving behind legacies that reshaped the American frontier. The hard life of frontier women. Life on the frontier was tough for everyone, but for women, it presented unique challenges. Many traveled west with their families, enduring long, grueling journeys by wagon or horseback. These women had to be incredibly resourceful, often serving as doctors, teachers, and caretakers for their families while also helping to build homes, grow food, and fend off dangers such as wild animals, disease, and hostile encounters. Homesteading women, in particular, played a crucial role in taming the land. Under the Homestead Act of 1862, settlers were given the opportunity to claim 160 acres of land, provided they could cultivate it. Many families took advantage of this opportunity, but survival depended on the labor of both men and women. Women planted crops, raised livestock, preserved food, and took care of children, all while living in primitive conditions with few conveniences. They had to be prepared for anything, from delivering babies to defending their homes from bandits or wild animals. Women in business and entrepreneurship. Not all women who moved west settled into traditional domestic roles. Many became successful entrepreneurs, taking advantage of new opportunities in growing frontier towns. With thousands of men flooding into the west during gold rushes and cattle booms, businesses catering to miners, ranchers, and railroad workers flourished. Women opened and ran hotels, general stores, boarding houses, saloons, and restaurants. Some became well known for their sharp business skills, amassing significant wealth in an era when women in the East had far fewer opportunities for financial independence. One famous example is Mary Ellen Pleasant, a successful African-American businesswoman who built a thriving network of hotels and restaurants in California during the gold rush. Others, like Madame Mustache and Eleanor Dumont, became known for running gambling establishments, often outsmarting their male counterparts in the rough-and-tumble world of frontier gambling. While some women engaged in less reputable professions, others found legitimate success as shopkeepers, traders, and landowners. Women in medicine and education. As towns sprang up across the West, the need for schools and medical care grew, and many women stepped into roles as teachers and nurses. Education was critical to the success of frontier communities, and female teachers were often among the first to arrive in new settlements. Some traveled long distances alone to teach children in remote areas, facing isolation and harsh conditions for the sake of spreading knowledge. In the medical field, women like Dr. Susan LaFlèche Picot, a Native American woman and the first Indigenous female doctor in the United States, made groundbreaking contributions to healthcare on the frontier. Many other women worked as midwives and healers, providing crucial care in towns where doctors were scarce. Their contributions saved lives and helped bring stability to communities struggling to establish themselves in a harsh and unpredictable environment. Women in law and order. While men traditionally held roles as lawmen, women were not entirely absent from the world of law enforcement. Some served as town marshals or worked in law offices, while others took justice into their own hands when necessary. One of the most famous female law enforcers was Mary Fields, also known as Stagecoach Mary. A former slave, she became the first African-American woman to work as a mail carrier for the U.S. Postal Service. She traveled alone through dangerous territory, armed with a shotgun to protect herself from bandits and wild animals. Her fearless reputation earned her the respect of cowboys and frontiersmen alike. Another notable figure was Pearl Hart, an outlaw who made headlines for robbing a stagecoach in Arizona in 1899. Unlike most women of her time, Hart refused to conform to societal expectations, dressing in men's clothing and carrying a revolver. Though she was eventually captured and imprisoned, her story became legendary, highlighting the fact that not all women on the frontier fit into traditional roles. Sharpshooters and entertainers. The Wild West was also home to legendary female sharpshooters and performers who captivated audiences across the country. Perhaps the most famous was Annie Oakley, a skilled markswoman who performed in Buffalo Bill's Wild West show. Her incredible shooting abilities earned her international fame, and she broke barriers for women in a sport dominated by men. Another well-known figure was Calamity Jane, a frontierswoman and scout known for her adventurous spirit and ability to handle a gun. Though her life was surrounded by myths and exaggerations, she was a real woman who worked as a scout for the U.S. Army and gained a reputation for her toughness. Women also played a major role in Western entertainment, from vaudeville performers to rodeo stars. Some, like Lillian Smith, challenged gender norms by competing in shooting contests against men, and often winning. Their presence in Wild West shows and traveling performances helped shape the romanticized image of the frontier that would later be popularized in books and movies. Women in politics and social reform. The West also provided women with opportunities for political and social activism that were often unavailable in the more established cities of the East. Because frontier communities were often more open to change, many Western states were among the first to grant women the right to vote. Wyoming, for example, became the first U.S. territory to grant women's suffrage in 1869, setting a precedent that other states would follow. Women's rights activists such as Esther Morris and Carrie Chapman Catt worked tirelessly to promote gender equality in the West. Many women also became involved in social reform movements, advocating for temperance, education, and Native American rights. Their efforts helped lay the foundation for broader national reforms that would come in the 20th century. The struggles and legacy of women in the Wild West. Despite their many contributions, women in the Wild West faced immense hardships. Many were widowed by violence or disease, forced to run farms and businesses alone. Others were limited by laws and customs that favored men, making it difficult to own property or exercise legal rights. Domestic violence was also a harsh reality, with few protections available for women in isolated frontier towns. Yet, against all odds, these women survived and often thrived. They defied expectations, broke barriers, and left behind a legacy that continues to inspire today. Their contributions were essential to the settlement and development of the West, proving that the story of the frontier was not just about cowboys and gunslingers, but also about the resilience, strength, and determination of the women who helped build it. The Wild West has long been a symbol of American identity, romanticized in movies, television shows, dime novels, and folklore. Images of rugged cowboys, fearless lawmen, gunslinging outlaws, and heroic pioneers have shaped how people perceive this era. However, the reality of the American frontier was far more complex, often harsher, and not nearly as glamorous as Hollywood would have us believe. The myth of the Wild West was created by sensationalized storytelling, but the truth tells a tale of struggle, diversity, and a society that was far from the simplistic good versus evil narratives that dominate popular culture. The origin of the Wild West myth. Much of the myth of the Wild West can be traced back to dime novels, cheap, mass-produced books published in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. These novels exaggerated the exploits of famous figures like Jesse James, Billy the Kid, Wyatt Earp, and Wild Bill Hickok, turning them into larger-than-life characters. Many of these stories were fictionalized or outright fabricated, but they captured the public's imagination, especially in the eastern United States, where readers were eager for tales of adventure on the frontier. Buffalo Bill Cody played a significant role in shaping the myth of the West through his traveling Wild West show. His performances featured dramatic reenactments of stagecoach robberies, gunfights, and Native American attacks, reinforcing the idea of a lawless frontier where brave cowboys and lawmen defended civilization against savages and criminals. In reality, many of these events were exaggerated or staged, designed more for entertainment than historical accuracy. Hollywood later took these myths and expanded upon them, producing countless Western films that depicted a world where white-hatted sheriffs always triumphed over black-hatted villains, where Native Americans were often reduced to nameless enemies, and where women were either helpless damsels or saloon girls. These simplistic portrayals ignored the complexities of the real West and the people who lived there. The truth about cowboys. One of the most enduring symbols of the Wild West is the cowboy, a rugged, independent figure riding across the open plains, protecting towns, and engaging in shootouts. While cowboys were indeed an important part of frontier life, their reality was far less glamorous. Most cowboys were cattle herders, not gunfighters. Their primary job was to drive cattle across long distances to railheads, where the animals could be shipped east. These drives were grueling, lasting weeks or even months, with cowboys facing harsh weather, stampedes, and the constant threat of cattle rustlers. Far from the romanticized figure portrayed in movies, the average cowboy worked long hours for low pay and had little social status. Additionally, the diversity of cowboys is often overlooked. A significant portion of cowboys, some estimates suggest up to 25%, were black, having moved west after the Civil War in search of better opportunities. Many others were Mexican vaqueros, whose cattle ranching skills influenced the American cowboy tradition. Native American and even Chinese cowboys also existed, but their contributions were largely erased from popular narratives. Gunfights and violence, more rare than portrayed. Movies and TV shows often depict the Wild West as a place where shootouts happened daily, where duels in the middle of the street were common, and where every dispute was settled with a gun. While violence certainly existed, the reality was far less dramatic. In many towns, strict gun control laws were enforced. Places like Dodge City, Kansas, and Tombstone, Arizona, required visitors to surrender their firearms upon entering town. Sheriffs and marshals worked hard to maintain order, and most people understood that random gunfights were bad for business. The famous quick-draw duels seen in Western films were almost entirely a myth. While some famous gunfights, such as the gunfight at the OK Corral, did occur, they were rare and usually not as organized as Hollywood would suggest. Most real violence happened in ambushes, drunken brawls, or planned attacks, rather than in dramatic showdowns at high noon, the reality of outlaws. The Wild West is often associated with famous outlaws like Jesse James, Billy the Kid, and Butch Cassidy. While these figures were certainly criminals, they were not always the heroic rebels that popular culture portrays them as. Jesse James, for example, is sometimes depicted as a Robin Hood-like figure who stole from the rich to give to the poor. In reality, James was a ruthless bank and train robber who, along with his gang, committed numerous murders. Similarly, Billy the Kid, who is often depicted as a misunderstood gunslinger, was an outlaw who participated in cattle rustling and deadly feuds. Many outlaws operated in organized gangs, using violence and intimidation to achieve their goals. Law enforcement struggled to capture them due to the vast and often ungoverned territories of the frontier. Some criminals even bribed local officials to turn a blind eye to their activities. Native Americans. Beyond the stereotypes, one of the most misleading aspects of the Wild West myth is the portrayal of Native Americans. In early Western stories and films, Indigenous people were often depicted as either noble savages or ruthless enemies, with little attention given to the complexity of their cultures, struggles, or resistance to westward expansion. In reality, Native American tribes had highly developed societies with their own political, economic, and cultural systems. The arrival of European settlers and the expansion of the railroad led to widespread displacement, broken treaties, and violent conflicts. The U.S. government forcibly removed many tribes from their ancestral lands, leading to tragic events such as the Trail of Tears and the Wounded Knee Massacre. Many Native American leaders, such as Sitting Bull, Geronimo, and Crazy Horse, fought fiercely to protect their people and way of life. Their resistance was often portrayed in the media as barbaric, but in truth, they were defending their homelands from an invading force that sought to erase their existence. Women in the West. More than just saloon girls. Another major myth about the Wild West is that it was a man's world. While men often dominated positions of power, women played an essential role in shaping the frontier. They were homesteaders, business owners, teachers, nurses, and even law enforcers. Many women moved west seeking independence, and some found success in ways that defied gender norms. Figures like Annie Oakley, Calamity Jane, and Mary Fields proved that women could be just as tough and capable as men. Others fought for women's rights, with Western states like Wyoming leading the way in granting women the right to vote. Conclusion. A more nuanced view of the Wild West. The Wild West was neither a lawless wasteland nor a land of pure heroism. It was a complex, ever-changing region shaped by diverse people. Cowboys, Native Americans, settlers, lawmen, outlaws, women, and immigrants, all of whom played a role in its history. The myths created by dime novels, Wild West shows, and Hollywood may have shaped our understanding of this period, but the truth is often far more fascinating than fiction, the lasting legacy of the Wild West. Cultural, economic, and social impact. The Wild West, often idealized and mythologized in popular culture, is a period in American history that continues to captivate and influence the modern world. The transformation of the frontier, from untamed wilderness to populated and economically thriving regions, left an indelible mark on the American identity and the broader global cultural landscape. The era shaped the social, political, and economic contours of the United States in profound ways, and its lasting legacy continues to be felt today, from the development of the American West to the mythologies that persist in modern media and popular culture. Economic foundations of the West. One of the most significant contributions of the Wild West to modern America is the economic transformation that took place during this time. The expansion of the railroad, the mining boom, and the growth of ranching and farming all played pivotal roles in shaping the American economy. The construction of the Transcontinental Railroad, which connected the eastern United States to the West Coast, was a major milestone that unlocked vast new markets and resources. Before the railroad, travel and trade across the country were slow, costly, and inefficient. Once the rail system was established, goods, people, and livestock could move at unprecedented speeds, opening up economic opportunities in the West that had previously been unimaginable. This transportation infrastructure made it easier for farmers to sell their crops, for miners to transport precious metals, and for cattle ranchers to supply beef to the eastern markets. The economic boom brought by the railroad also led to the rise of boom towns, which were born out of the discovery of gold, silver, and other valuable minerals in the West. These towns experienced rapid growth, often rising overnight, and many became major cities that still thrive today. The discovery of gold in California in 1848 set off the gold rush, which attracted hundreds of thousands of prospectors and settlers. The mining industry transformed the landscape, brought immense wealth to some, and ultimately spurred further settlement and development in the region. Ranching also flourished during this period, with the introduction of large-scale cattle drives that spanned thousands of miles. The development of cattle ranching, along with the establishment of vast farms to supply food and crops, helped form the backbone of the agricultural economy in the West. These industries became the economic foundation of the region, contributing to the overall growth of the United States as an industrial power. Cultural influence, the Wild West myth, and the American identity. The Wild West cultural legacy is perhaps most enduring in its influence on American identity and its portrayal in art, literature, film, and television. The romanticized image of the cowboy, the lawman, the outlaw, and the pioneer became iconic symbols of American rugged individualism, self-reliance, and frontier spirit. These ideals are deeply embedded in the American consciousness and continue to shape perceptions of what it means to be American. Hollywood films, particularly those produced during the early to mid-20th century, solidified the imagery of the Wild West in the public imagination. Movies such as Stagecoach, 1939, The Searchers, 1956, and High Noon, 1952, offered dramatized depictions of the heroic and often morally ambiguous figures who populated the frontier. The myth of the Wild West was often framed as a place where the forces of law and order squared off against lawlessness and chaos, with good always triumphing over evil. While this idealized version of the West was far removed from historical reality, it became a defining narrative for both the United States and for global audiences. The Wild West mythology also helped shape the development of Western literature. Writers like Zane Grey and Louis L'Amour popularized tales of adventure, exploration, and moral conflict on the frontier. Their works became staples of Western fiction, influencing generations of readers and writers alike. Even today, the themes of the Wild West continue to be explored in modern media, from books to video games to TV shows and movies. These stories still reflect the desire for personal freedom, adventure, and the promise of a better life that characterized the westward expansion. Moreover, the legacy of the Wild West in popular culture influenced how people from different regions and countries viewed America. The West became synonymous with the frontier spirit, self-made success, and the idea that anyone, regardless of background, could forge a new life in the vast unknown. These images of the American frontier continue to serve as a source of national pride and inspiration, although they obscure the complex realities of the time. The social fabric of the West: diversity, struggle, and transformation. The Wild West was, contrary to many Hollywood depictions, a culturally diverse region populated by people from all walks of life and backgrounds. The myths surrounding the era often exclude or diminish the role of non-white individuals and immigrant groups, but in reality, they were central to the development of the West. Native Americans, for instance, experienced both the tragic consequences of westward expansion and the continuation of their cultural resilience. Although many tribes were forcibly displaced, massacred, or confined to reservations, their influence on the development of the West cannot be ignored. Native American tribes, such as the Apache, Sioux, and Cheyenne, resisted U.S. encroachment on their lands, and their struggle for survival became emblematic of the larger battles over control of the frontier. Native American culture, traditions, and contributions, such as their knowledge of the land, their craftsmanship, and their agricultural practices, were vital to the growth of the West, even though their history was often overshadowed by settler narratives. Black Americans also played an important role in the Wild West, despite often being relegated to the margins of historical accounts. After the Civil War, many African Americans moved westward in search of greater freedom and opportunity. A significant number became cowboys, soldiers, and farmers, contributing to the expansion of the frontier. Figures like Nat Love, who worked as a cowboy and later became a famous writer, and Bass Reeves, one of the first black U.S. Marshals in the West, became legends in their own right. The legacy of African Americans in the West has been underappreciated in mainstream historical accounts, but their impact is undeniable. Mexican Americans, especially in the southwestern United States, were integral to the development of the West. They introduced important agricultural techniques, as well as cattle ranching traditions, and shaped the cultural identity of the region through their customs, food, language, and arts. However, their contributions were often overshadowed by the dominant narratives of Anglo settlers. The Mexican-American community in the West faced significant social and political challenges, including the loss of land due to legal discrimination and the forced assimilation policies of the U.S. government. Women, too, made significant contributions to the social fabric of the West, and their role has often been undervalued or overlooked. Women were not just the wives and mothers of homesteaders. They were also pioneers, educators, business owners, and activists. In fact, several Western states, including Wyoming and Utah, were among the first to grant women the right to vote, making the West an important center of the early women's suffrage movement. The contributions of women to the growth and development of the West have become more recognized in recent years, yet their stories still deserve further exploration and appreciation. The Wild West and its political impact on American expansion. Politically, the Wild West was pivotal in shaping the future of the United States. The expansion of the frontier was a key factor in the country's westward growth and the consolidation of its borders. The Manifest Destiny ideology, which held that it was America's divine right to expand its territory across the continent, was a driving force behind much of the westward expansion. The establishment of new states and territories in the West helped to solidify the political landscape of the United States, extending its influence over the continent and contributing to the rise of the U.S. as an economic and political power. With the discovery of gold and other valuable resources, the West became a source of immense wealth, attracting people from all over the world. This wealth, however, also led to conflicts, as different groups vied for control of land, resources, and power. The conflicts between settlers, Native Americans, and Mexican residents were not only economic, but also deeply political, as these groups fought for control of territory and governance. The development of law and order in the West, with the creation of martial systems, sheriffs, and the establishment of state governments, also had lasting political effects. The West became a testing ground for democracy, with settlers debating the kinds of political systems and legal frameworks they wanted to implement. Western territories were often sites of experimentation in politics, where new ideas about governance, civil rights, and representation were explored. These political battles would shape the United States' future as it continued to expand and develop into a modern nation. The continuing legacy in modern times. Today, the Wild West legacy is still very much alive in American culture. Its influence can be seen in everything from modern Western films and television shows to rodeos, country music, and the enduring image of the cowboy. The myth of the Wild West continues to shape how Americans view the frontier, individualism, and the spirit of adventure. However, the true legacy of the Wild West lies in the lessons it teaches about survival, adaptation, and the challenges of creating a society in an often inhospitable environment. The era's complexity, marked by moments of intense struggle, survival, and sometimes violence, reminds us that the American frontier was far more than just a romanticized period of exploration. The West was a region shaped by diverse people, cultures, and forces, each contributing to the larger narrative of American history. The Wild West left behind a powerful legacy, one that continues to be felt and reflected in the ways Americans perceive themselves and their country's past. In conclusion, the Wild West is far more than the romanticized and action-packed scenes often depicted in films and novels. It was a complex, diverse, and at times brutal period in American history that shaped the nation's economy, culture, and identity in profound ways. While the myths and legends of cowboys, outlaws, and shootouts continue to captivate our imaginations, the reality of the Wild West was a tale of perseverance, conflict, and transformation. From the rise of industries to the resilience of Native Americans, African Americans, women, and immigrants, the Wild West was a melting pot of cultures and experiences that laid the foundation for the modern United States. Understanding the truth behind the myth allows us to appreciate the multifaceted nature of this era and reflect on the lasting impact it has had on the country we know today. The Wild West may live on in stories and films, but its legacy is woven into the very fabric of America, reminding us of the struggles, triumphs, and diversity that shaped the nation.